Today in Rabbles, a brief long history of the working class family, the complexity of dialectical thinking, queer communes, and much more. With Amy O'Brien.
Yeah, I'm recording.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. Well then let's jump right in. So today we're joined by Michelle O'Brien, and Michelle is a psychoanalyst and a writer based in New York City. And she's also currently the co-editor of Pinko magazine. And we're so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Felix and I both read your essay in EndNotes called To Abolish the Family, the Working Class Family and Gender Liberation and Capitalist Development. He sent it to me during the Christmas break in December, like, Alex, you need to read this. And we've talked a lot about it and we really loved it. So we're really excited to have you to talk about it. And we thought just to start, it would be cool if you could sort of run us through the history that you chart in the piece. So you chart the history of family abolition from sort of the early 19th century, 1830s until today, and show that we can periodize that history of the family according to distinct phases of capitalist development. And it's a really helpful sort of heuristic for thinking about family abolition in the longue durée. So if you could just sort of run us through how you sketch it, that would be great to get us started.
Sure. So trying to summarize what is a quite dense argument, I came to the argument because I was interested in trying to think more coherently or systematically about the changing queer and gender politics, sexual and gender politics of communist movements and revolutionary movements over the course of the last 150 years, and particularly sort of what at moments that large numbers of proletarian insurgents are thinking about the transformation of gender sexuality in liberatory ways, what form does that take? And I, through editing the Revolutionary Feminism reader for the Communist Research Cluster, I'd spent a lot of time reading these historical texts and realizing that they actually meant wildly contradictory things when they critiqued the family or suggested that a free society would transform family relations or abolish family relations. And so this was an effort at sort of systematically trying to hold this, the transforming meanings of family and gender and sexuality. And it uses the framework of EndNotes and theorie communiste, a certain periodization of the workers' movement, as this particular phase of proletarian struggle between the 1890s and the 1970s. So the phases that I talk about are prior to the 1880s, 1890s, so that particularly focusing on Marx and Engels and the Communist Manifesto, and a little bit about their debates with Fourier, and a little bit about the American plantation system. So I include both inland, it's sort of thinking about the Marxist movement or the socialist movement centered around Marx, and as well as the United States, particularly thinking about Black insurgency and the history of slavery and Jim Crow. And the essay goes back and forth between those. So what do Marx and Engels mean? And then later, what is meant by the family in the Communist International? And then, and as it's sort of left opposition, what emerges during the Soviet Revolution, and then later in thinking about sort of the challenge to the family in the 1960s and some of the mass insurgencies of that period, and then moving into what has happened since the 1970s. And so in each one of those phases, looking at what is a sort of dominant or hegemonic notion of the family, how does that get taken up by the communist movement, by revolutionary movements? What is it that they mean? And then what are the sort of furthest liberatory edges of that? And what are the contradictions of that? And in that, This is very hard to summarize. So for Marx and Engels, when they talk about the family, they're really talking exclusively about the bourgeois family. They don't see the family as having any meaning in proletarian society. And that was tied up with the intense destabilization of the peasant family that happened in early industrialization. And so I both look at sort of their quite radical critique of the bourgeois family, but also their tendencies towards criticism of sex workers, of sexual degeneracy, of implied queerness happening in proletarian communities at the same time. So when the Communist Manifesto mentions the family, they're really talking about the challenge of the bourgeois family. And similarly, you could look at what was happening in the plantations in the United States, where the family meant something very clear and well ordered in white slave-owning society. But for slaves, the level of natal alienation of people being denied long-term relationships with their children or their partners meant that the family had very little coherent meaning. And so the challenge to the family was part of the challenge to bourgeois society. What shifted in the 1890s was a consolidation of a certain model of socialist struggle that was enabled by capitalist development, by the expansion of working class power. And in Germany, the United States, the parts of the United States, inland parts of Europe, the consolidation of this normative family form, where for the first time working class people could have a wife at home, not working children really pushed out of the labor force and into schools, and with a male breadwinner who is the sort of head of the family and economically controls a significant portion of it. And sort of this model of the family in this context, the family becomes a way of dividing between lumpen, between underemployed, between the poor and the respectable working class. So it becomes a way of aspiring to bourgeois respectability that becomes a part of the Second International. And this is challenged by Alexander Kollontai and some of what happened during the Russian Revolution, where there's this effort at the mass collectivization of reproductive labor in the household, of canteens, of collective laundries, of collective creches and childcare centers that happened in desperation, in survival during the Russian Civil War. And so I talk about that and what Kollontai imagines being on the other side of compulsory heterosexuality, but also recognizing the contradictions wrapped up in this being consolidated on a large scale within the state and the meaning of that. And then in the late 1960s, looking at the challenge to the family that plays out across the welfare rights movement and sort of Black feminism generally, gay liberation, lesbian feminism, and the feminist struggle, where the family for them is the family of the suburbs. So a kind of particular American development model that gets exported around the world of a massification of like a certain kind of bourgeois cultural and social norm that is dominated by white working class and middle class people, becomes more accessible and has rebelling against its heteronormative character, its white characters being a big part of the insurgency in the 60s. And then looking since the 1970s at the kind of breakdown of the normative family for working class people, that it sort of was never accessible to the majority of Black people, but increasingly it's impossible to have a male breadwinner with a housewife for the vast majority of working class people. And unfortunately, that is not because of the expansion of feminism or queer liberation or anything else. It would be much more positive if that was the driving core of it. But instead, the economic crisis that has gripped the capitalist world for decades and the difficulty of working class social reproduction, and that this entails some more freedom for queer people, for women in some ways, but at a really grave cost, which is the increasing control by employers, by the market, the need to go out and get a job, the kinds of abuses that happen in the workplace or the labor market. And so throughout the essay, I'm sort of looking at the state, the market, and the family as the three main modes of working class social reproduction, and how any liberatory politics of the family for our era must necessarily challenge all three. So rather than seeing the social reproduction of the family being taken up in the market as we are, right, as you can drop your laundry off, you can pick up fast food, you can drop your kids off, you can do all these marketized services that replace elements of family labor, or the state in like state-owned creches or something, that recognizing that all of these are different forms of capitalist domination in working class people's lives, and then any sort of like that what we need is a vision of liberation that moves simultaneously beyond the family, the market, and the state. So that's my argument.
That's so impressively lucid. Okay, so that sets us up really nicely. So you mentioned that the male breadwinner family wasn't available to Black families in the United States. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the family, it's really like the white family that we're talking about. And this comes up a lot within critiques of family abolition. So there are sort of familiar critiques within Black studies and postcolonial literature. And I found this quote from a 1982 piece by Hazel Carby, where she writes that we would not wish to deny that the family can be a source of oppression for us, but we also wish to examine how the Black family has functioned as a prime source of resistance to opposition, to oppression.
Absolutely.
We need to recognize that during slavery, periods of colonialism, and under the present authoritarian state, the Black family has been a site of political and cultural resistance to racism. So this was back in the 80s, but also recently we've seen a number of voices, once again, sort of reiterating some of these criticisms of family abolition. And I just wanted to ask how proponents of family abolition have responded to some of these critiques or incorporated them within the political current.
Yeah, I think this is really such a crucial question, and my essay tries to take that up, as does my essay in Pinko. And we need a lot more work that grapples with some of the fascinating work on natal alienation, of kinship in Black communities and Black insurgency, and thinking about that alongside the histories of queer liberation and feminism. What I would say is that family abolition absolutely does not call, or no family abolitionists that I know personally, none that I know that are published, certainly none that I would support, the further erosion and breakdown of people's ability to form relationships of care. That humans need an enormous amount of care as infants, as old people, when we're disabled. We need love, we need access to healthy sexual relationships, we need people that we can live with, that we need lots of care, and that family abolition necessarily is not the destruction of relationships of care, nor their replacement by the state or the market, but instead their expansion throughout society in such a way that people are able to exercise far greater range of choices about their gender expression and their sexual relationships without it telling economic costs. And so absolutely, for large numbers of working class people, certainly for large numbers of Black Americans, the family has been a really important mechanism of defense against certain forms of state violence. It has many contradictions in providing that. It provides it to some people more than others, but that system of care is not like the efforts of mass incarceration, border detention policies, like all of these systems through which the economic needs of migration, through which the market or the state might erode people's ability to care for each other. As communists, the only answer is to fight those institutions, to fight those state policies, to fight the domination of the market, and to expand people's ability to form whatever kind of relationships are supportive and loving to them. Certainly, my critique is mainly of the white family, but it's not exclusively. That actually, I think that proletarian people, Black people, lots of other folks around the world have to rely on their family as their main form of support entails lots of problems for queer and trans people. And like, I'm really interested in research that has drawn attention to the enthusiasm of Black people entering into urbanization with being able to have sex outside of a marital relation, being able to escape the coercive heterosexuality of the Jim Crow sharecropping system, of recognizing that like Black sexual freedom, Black queer freedom, Black feminist freedom, which haven't always been opposed to the Black family, but have been absolutely opposed to a certain kind of violent heterosexuality that was a part of sharecropping in particular in the United States and a part of American racism. And so that I'm interested both in sort of like primarily critiquing the most normative oppressive families, while also recognizing that even radical families, even queer families, even working class Black families, it bear within them contradictions that only by expanding the circles of care can we meaningfully address those to really meet the needs of queer and trans people, of women, of lots and lots of other people who are might survive through families, but at significant cost.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I think one of the hard things also when we try to have like this materialist analysis of the transformations of capitalism is that it demands from us to have kind of this strange relationship with what capitalism has brought in the way of observing some venues to some opening towards some more forms of freedom that at the same time dialectically bring new forms of domination. And that's kind of a thing that sometimes evades our way of thinking, just like to think in dichotomies of like either good or bad, for instance. And that's thing. I wanted to talk about something that you mentioned in the introduction as well that I find interesting, and I would like to know what you think about this. So one of our personal interests also with this channel is to understand the different ways in which the development of the labor movement and or Marxism has contributed to alienate particular groups from developing their self-conscious identification as part of the working class, or how these tendencies sometimes is even mean now re-enhanced in the like most romantic reactionary Marxist recall of the past strong labor movements, and how this sometimes it even turns against some sort of like very poor criticism of like queer movements of feminism as like eroding class solidarity, for instance. Yeah. And so this difficult relation between those that are placed outside the working class is dialectical and paradoxical in the way that while they have been put outside, Marxism has many times provided like the analytical tools to understand the roots of the logic of their oppression, even though like many times was outside the more orthodox labor movement, if you want to put it like that. Although like there's always been like a complex relation there. So I was compelled to think from your text about the way in which this call for family, the family unit and the respectability of the family within the working class has contributed to fractured solidarity between like some sort of like part of the working class and those that are like the other parts, like the lumpen proletariats, queers, sex workers, or like even colonial subjects. And what does it mean for how we think about contemporary demands that could lead to the dramatical improvement in working class families, for instance, and not consolidate this division and between civilized working class families and racialized sexual deviants others?
Sure. I certainly ethically and politically, I think it's crucial, clearly, to trace out the long history of queer and women proletarians in struggle and challenging the gender and sexual normativity that's been a part of working class movements, the orthodox, socialist, or labor movement, and particularly, looking at the racial contradictions in the United States and colonial contradictions globally in thinking about proletarian and anti-capitalist struggle is essential to make sense of anything about world history. One thing that I thought about in this essay that was challenging to me was thinking about how much was gained by consolidating an orthodox, conservative, exclusionary workers' movement in Europe and in the United States. That right now, all the people I encounter who counterpose, the sort of trans, queer degenerates to working, the true blue collar working class are clearly proto-fascists. They're so obviously steeped in a politics that will lead to terrible right-wing conclusions, and they are political enemies of any meaningful proletarian struggle. And I would locate sort of currents of the dirtbag left, of the sort of elements of the DSA, elements, this sort of we have the only socialist identified op-ed columnist in the New York Times has been targeting queer and trans people and suggesting in Twitter recently that trans people who support gender self-determination for children are pedophiles. There's a just incredibly nasty edge. That it can be hard to remember that in the 1890s, the same sort of culturally conservative turn in socialist politics won a massive improvement for a strata of the working class at grave cost to the long-term future of communist struggle. But they won the franchise, they won a huge economic improvement in the standard of living, they won much safer workplaces, they won running water, just a massive improvement in public health. And they significantly expanded overall progressive state policies that benefited lots of other people. And I could see how someone could fantasize that this might be possible again. But the truth is, the dynamics of capitalist crisis, it will never be possible again. That this sort of vision of the white male working class being able to win a whole host, like a social democratic society, fundamentally misreads how much capitalism has changed. And back then, it might have been a devil's bargain that undermined the long-term insurgent power of the working class, excluded huge sections of the working class, of proletarians out of the official working class, reorganized socialist politics around bourgeois respectability. But it did so with massive victories to show for it. And now the dynamics of kind of white maleness can only maintain power by consolidating a cross-class white supremacist patriarchal bloc we see in figures like Trump. And they cannot translate into meaningful economic benefits, that the crisis of capitalism is too deep, and that there's no way forward without thinking about a strategy that actually includes the broad heterogeneity and richness and diversity of the actually existing proletarians. That doesn't just take a sliver of the most privileged and sort of fashion a fantasy labor movement out of that. And that the people doing that now, it's a horrible dead end that will lead nowhere.
Felix, did you have a follow-up? That was such a crucial point. Okay, because so when we look at politics today, this is often counterposed with sort of like queer commune building. So there's all kinds of creative reimaginings of family life that we find today. And many of the people engaged in those efforts argue that they're experimental forms of communal living also prefigure the abolition of the family, or even indeed that they prefigure communism. And you briefly touch on this towards the end of the essay. There's this one quote where you write, "The aspirations of queer, feminist, and Black leftists to love and care for each other in the face of the brutality of this world cannot be realized in conditions of generalized market dependency. Today's queer community does not and cannot prefigure communism. I was wondering if you could expand on this a little bit. And also, I guess sort of like the next follow-up question is how just in general, how you think the program for family abolition can be framed as part of a shared horizon for sexual and gender emancipation.
Sure. So I elaborate on this a bit in my article in Pinko, Communes and Care, in the first issue of Pinko, where I try to sort of think about the future of family abolition, if this essay is about its past. So I think whatever proletarians do to love for and care for each other is wonderful. And that can take the form of Black families, that can take the form of chosen families across a lot of different sectors in society, that can take the form of queer communes. These things are all to be celebrated, to be defended, to be grappled with. They all entail lots of contradictions, but they when you actually get down to looking at the dynamics of queer communes, the pressures on them within a capitalist society are tremendous, where, like, how do you acquire land? How do you keep paying the rent? How do you keep the bills paid, right, of utilities? And the class dynamics, the racial dynamics that play out within queer communes, the power dynamics that play out within them, the pressures around like people living in this very particular chosen way until they are either sort of age out, and because they're class privileged, move up in the labor market and want more space, or because they're not class privileged, are no longer able to afford to continue to live there, right? And so you see, these brief moments of people in their like early 20s that are extremely difficult to sustain and are constantly under a lot of pressure. I have spent a lot of time living in queer communes and loving them, and watching people have children and getting very little support from their like long-term chosen family. And so we shouldn't be surprised in our capitalist society that efforts at alternative chosen family end up taking on some of the contradictions and limitations of other kinds of family, because they are within a sea of capitalist social relations. And I'm very skeptical that creating small alternative pockets have much of anything to do with communism. They might, in some settings, become a part of a much broader communist project, but whether they're short-term or long-term, that what it takes to reproduce yourself in a capitalist society is to take on some of the core characteristics of what's necessary for survival under capitalism. I am interested in the commune sort of chosen family structures as they unfold in expanding moments of mass insurgency. So that's something that I take very seriously. And in Pinko, I begin to talk about this. So during moments of Occupy Wall Street, during the mass teacher strikes and mass insurgencies in Oaxaca a few years ago, during sort of looking at some of the dynamics in the late 1960s during periods of mass insurgency, and particularly sort of thinking about a communizing scenario. So a scenario where millions of proletarians are in direct revolt against the state and market relations and directly seizing the means of production and the means of reproducing social life. How would people reproduce themselves in that context? And there's a quite elegant Angry Workers article that sort of surveys what a communizing scenario could mean in the United Kingdom. And they suggest people organizing themselves in social reproduction units of about 200. And this makes a lot of sense to me, that if you're trying to organize consumption, particularly, not production, but consumption of like, who do you acquire food for and redistribute food for and cook for, like the unit of about 200 could work really well. And so this sort of model of the commune, this vision of the commune, which in this sort of framework, it makes very little difference if anyone prefigures anything right now, or if anyone tries to create those, but trying instead to think about family abolition as something that could only occur during mass communizing struggle. And in that context, that it could take the form of the commune as a strategy of reproduction and survival. So that's some of where my thinking ended up going, and I continue to be interested in that. Anyhow, this touches on something else, but I briefly lost the thread. Maybe it'll come back to me.
No, and actually we should link both of also that Pinko essay in the description, because it's so good for thinking about these contradictions within various family forms. I actually have another question, which is, if we periodize the history of the family within capitalist development, these analyses tend to stress how the family has been deeply functional to capitalism in all of its various iterations, as a sort of sphere of privatized social reproduction. Can you say something about where you, so the family is deeply functional to capital. Can you say something about the state?
Well, that's not my argument.
Okay, or sorry. Well then,
I have a non-functional argument.
Okay, so then can you tell us how, like, we escape this sort of functionalism, but also perhaps say something about the relation between the family and the state?
Sure. I think the family form was very functional for settler colonialism. And I don't write about that in the essay, but I think if you looked at the frontier of the United States and Canada or Australia, the heterosexual white family form was really essential to settler colonialism. That in the absence of sort of generalized market relations and a well-functioning state, when you had settlers out on the frontier figuring out how to participate in a campaign of genocide and colonial expansion, that they really needed the family form in order to be able to do that. So I think you can look at the history of settler colonialism, both in terms of an imposition of the family on indigenous peoples and the necessity of the white family for that expansion. Once you have generalized market relations or a well-functioning settler society, I think the family is not essential. And so the breakdown of the family has not entailed a significant crisis of capitalism, for example. So I don't think there's much of anything necessary about the family. You just need some way of like raising children and getting people into the workforce, and that there are a wide variety of ways of doing that. There's been a lot of great research. Kate Joyle Griffiths, a comrade and friend, has thought a lot about the dynamics of apartheid South Africa, and Black men were moved into dorms associated with large business enterprises. This is happening in China on a huge scale, and Southeast Asia, of people working in dormitories associated with businesses, and the really interesting things that happen in these dynamics. And there are lots of other ways of doing social reproduction besides the family. My argument is that the family of the 1890s, being generalized to the working class or the white working class, was a product of class struggle. It was struggled for and obtained by the working class as a demand of the upper strata of the working class. And the fact that they were modeling their demand off of bourgeois norms helped out with their struggle, and helped out with it appealing to bourgeois liberals and resonating sort of broadly, becoming more hegemonic in society. But the victory of male breadwinner families was not the result of bourgeois anxieties in the 1840s and 50s about the crisis of the working class family, or the many bourgeois social workers being like, how can we help working class people organize coherent families? Let's go out in communities and try to teach them about family norms, which happened. But those efforts were nowhere near to the scale to actually be able to impose family norms. And that by and large, employers had very little direct control over how people organized their private lives, and that instead it was the working class struggle itself that demanded and won this normative family. So it's a non-functional argument. In terms of the state, the thinking that I've seen most successful is really around looking at this in terms of settler colonialism. I've spent a lot of time reading kind of debates within the state about the family in the 1960s and the Black family, where it's like we need to figure out how to intervene in the fragmentation of Black families and encourage people to marry. You have, welfare reform involved all these marriage incentives and trying to coerce people into marriage in various ways. And I don't think those state efforts are anywhere near organized enough or on a large enough scale to actually have a huge impact on how working class people choose to have sex or live together. That it's the sort of the modern welfare states have built into them various norms of families that have an influence on people's thinking and ideas, but actually they're not only the labor market and only people's mass desires are on a big enough scale to actually be able to define the structure of families.
Oh, that's actually that's interesting, because it is quite different how many others are theorizing the family at the moment, but I also think really convincing as well. Felix, do you have any other questions?
No, I think it's really interesting, everything you've been discussing today. Also, challenging the functionalist understanding of family as there's this tendency of thinking that breaking the family in itself is challenging necessarily capitalism, but what we are talking about is a unit of privatized social reproduction, basically.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It can take many different forms, as you were saying, which I think is really, I found it really productive in the way of thinking about this, how you put it also in the essay, this idea of family being the product of class struggle. It is not that, otherwise we tend to see capitalism extends everywhere and adapts our social relations to that as a absolute force, and everything we observe is the result with some blockage that we have managed to put somehow through struggle, and that's not always the way it comes to be. I was thinking about some of the things you said before, but I think maybe we shouldn't go back to that, because it's been very interesting, everything we've been discussing. So I don't think I have really anything else to add. I don't know if you, Alex, has something else.
No, I just think we should link all the pieces. Also, didn't you also write a sort of fictional account of life 200 years? I remember reading that a long time ago, and this morning it occurred to me that I think you wrote that. We should link them all, because they're really great, and I would just encourage people to read the work.
Yeah, it's a fictional oral history of a young trans girl growing up in a commune in Newark, and sort of reflecting on the history of struggle, the creation of mass communes and the abolition of the family as she understands it, having grown up afterwards. And it was published in Comintern.
I have to say, I read it without knowing anything, with no I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and it took me an embarrassing long amount of time until I realized that it was fictional and not actually something. I thought it was written today about this girl that had grown up I don't know how long ago, and I started Googling what happened in Newark, but which says something about how sort of convincing and well written it is. Anyway, thanks so much. This has been a blast. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Sagen wir mal, diese Grundidee von Kommunismus, ne, die ist ja voll geil. 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 Die is 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 ja voll geil.
Однако русские коммунисты выстоят. Есть бывали трудности. Так и не справились.